Thank you for joining us today at the 2018 Academy of the Social Sciences Symposium. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional land we meet and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. For those who don't know me, my name is Liz West and I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Academy. It's unexpected that I should be warming up the microphone today, as this is the well-worn spot of Dr. John Beaton. Tragically, John passed away last week. Those of us who work closely with John have found some humor in the fact that undertaking all of the planning and preparation, but avoiding the speeches, would have been how he designed it if he had a choice. We all miss him tremendously, but our lives are greatly improved for having known him. The Academy will be hosting a public memorial for John tomorrow from 1:30 to 2:30 in the Shine Dome, just in the Jaeger room off to the side, following the AGM, and all are welcome. In the spirit of John's 17 years of dedication to the Academy, we carry on. I would like to now welcome to the stage Professor Glenn Withers, the President of the Academy, to open the symposium. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liz, and welcome, colleagues. I have 4 things only to go through with you. One is to officially open the symposium. Another is to welcome all fellows, new fellows, and our guests to the occasion. The third is to exhort you, if you need it, to enjoy a day of engaging with the thinking of other folk of good mind and good spirit addressing important issues. A rare privilege, and one this Academy is, of course, delighted to host, sponsor, support, and we all look forward to the deliberations and the insights accordingly, so that we can understand better the turbulent world around us. And 4, I'm to ask you to refer to the program, to read your presenters' bios, and in that spirit, so that we won't spend time going through long careers for you for each speaker, many if not all, who are already well known to you anyway. But in that spirit, let me simply shift straight away to our symposium conveners, Professor Adam Graycar and Dr. Adam Masters, so that they can detail the symposium that they especially have constructed for you today. So over to the Adams. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Welcome, everybody. Well, we're meeting today to talk about trust, integrity, and corruption, and whether these infect our society, whether they cause us problems, if some of them, like trust and integrity, are diminishing, what we can do about it, and if corruption is increasing, what we can do about it. Because without trust and integrity in our institutions, our society just simply won't function well. If we have corruption in our institutions, all our public policies, all the research that our social scientists do in public policy will be totally undermined, because you won't be able to implement anything because it'll go the wrong way. If we have ethnic and cultural divisions that are fostered, then our society will be diminished. And globally, if we look at the big picture, globally, we see political leaders with unexplained wealth. We see political leaders around the world fostering cultural, fostering ethnic and cultural divisions. And when we have unexplained wealth, when we have cultural and ethnic tensions in our societies, then trust is monumentally diminished. We see, for example, in the most powerful nation on earth, a president who lies to his people, who has conflicts of interest that simply wouldn't be tolerated in modern societies, who pays considerably less than his fair share of taxes, and has undermined the integrity of some of his agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Justice. And the question is, are we headed down that same path? Is there a hint of this? But if there is a hint of it, if there's any hint of it, what do we do to stop the slide? When I travel to international conferences, people always say to me, "Oh, you're so lucky to live in Australia where there's no corruption," because I work in the corruption field by and large. And I say, well, it's not quite like that. Sure, people in Australia can go about their daily lives without the fear of being shaken down by a corrupt public official. But we have a strong momentum, as you'll hear this afternoon, for the establishment of a national anti-corruption or integrity agency. There is unease, there is a diminution of trust. The last couple of years haven't been real good. We've seen the banks stealing from their customers. We've seen bankers portraying the ethics of ruthless predators. We've seen our religious institutions abusing the trust of people who look to them for support. We see Indigenous people betrayed. We've seen Prime Ministers undermined and dispatched. We've seen Ministers of Education not trusting the Academy in terms of the judgments that it makes. And sometimes we call for the good old days. But were the good old days really all that good? Well, that's a question. Are we hankering after 20th century institutions in a 21st century world? Well, you'll hear about a lot of these things today, and it's important to look forward and retool and redesign and not just look backward and lament. So you're going to be listening to a very distinguished set of speakers throughout the day. And as you listen to them, there are 3 points, just 3 points I want you to ponder on during the day. The first one is trust really eroding? And perhaps is a diminution of trust the new normal? Secondly, has bad leadership always been with us, but are we doing well because we're exposing it publicly and calling it out? And thirdly, and importantly, how can the social sciences contribute to an improved integrity framework? What can your discipline, and those of you from government and elsewhere, what can your agency do to strengthen our integrity framework? So I look forward to hearing our speakers today. I hope you can ponder on some of these questions, and I'm sure that you'll find it a most interesting and informative day. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Liz. And of course, thank you, Glenn. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Adam Masters. I stand before you as possibly the most junior academic in the room, having been given tenure at the ANU yesterday. Thank you. So I've got a long way to go before I achieve my fellowship. Like all scholars, I stand on the shoulder of giants, and the giants are in this room. Well-respected academics, well-respected practitioners. I'm a former practitioner myself, and I understand the role of integrity and how incredibly important it is. For years, I used to be called to meetings. Commissioner Mick Keelty from the Federal Police would gather us all together, and he would generally say, if an agency doesn't have integrity, it's got nothing. It takes a moment to lose and it takes forever to regain. And this is the position we find ourselves in Australia today. So my role today is MC. It's not a huge intellectual contributor, so I'll continue to stand on the shoulders of giants and I'll stay on their backs and keep them on time. There will be a bell to keep things moving. And I would invite Scott Ludlam, Mr Grant King, and Professor Stephen Parker to please join Michelle Grattan here on stage for our first session. Cassandra? Okay, our facilitator today is Michelle Grattan, who has edited books, and I won't go too much into the biography, but I did want to mention this. She's edited books I've relied on heavily on Prime Ministers of Australia. She now probably has the toughest job in the country, keeping up with the rotation. So I will hand over to Michelle, who will run our first session, Mapping the Problem. What are the integrity issues? We're going to hear from politics, Scott Ludlam, our former senator, Grant King from Business Council of Australia, Cassandra Goldie from the Australian Council of Social Services, and Stephen Parker, whose experience in higher education most of you are familiar with. So please give a welcome to Michelle Grattan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in this session, we'll have brief contributions from all of us, and then a bit of discussion on the panel, and then open it to questions. Trust, we can confidently say, I think, is one of the central issues for our society today. Lack of political trust is definitely having a corrosive effect on our democracy, and it needs to be addressed. But the will and the means to address this problem just appear to be missing. To the extent that people lack trust in the media, and it will be the media that will be the focus of my address today, this contributes to the weakening of the political system, because the media is one of the glues that binds that system together, or, if you want to look at it another way, one of the lubricants to make the system work. Now, we haven't suddenly moved from some golden age of trust to one of cynicism and distrust. Everything wasn't wonderful way back when. But there has been a disturbing decline in political trust over decades, well documented, and the coming of the internet age in particular has deepened problems in relation to trust in the media. Research done this year and soon to be released by the University of Canberra's Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis produced some damning figures on politicians and the media. It found that the least trusted institutions are political parties on 16%, web-based media 20%, print media 29%, trade unions 30%, federal government 31%, TV 32%. Our least trusted professions, you mightn't be surprised to know, are MPs 21%, ministers, government ministers 23%, unionists 26%, journalists 28%. The 2012 ANU poll found the armed forces and the police were trusted by more than 8 in 10 people. In contrast, the media was trusted by fewer than 1 in 4. And actually, some 44% had the perception of the media as corrupt, which I must say I found surprising, despite issues like cash for comment and the like. However, some of the empirical data is more encouraging. Another University of Canberra study, this one from the News and Media Research Centre, suggests some recent improvements in trust. But in that survey, although there was a rise in trust in news media, the trust in news on social media, which is the main source of news these days for younger people, remained very low. The earlier Canberra University work that I referred to showed that 38% trusted radio, 32% trusted TV, and the figure for print was 29%, while only 20% trusted the web. Now, let me turn to some of the factors that undermine trust in the media. One is the matter of subjectivity. Newspapers long ago, of course, gave up any claim to be journals of record. Judgments about whether TV or newspapers choose to highlight the right stories will often depend on the consumer's perspective. And that's even when the media outlet is trying to pursue the never quite attainable goal of objectivity. But much more fundamental to this question of trust is the disruption that's been produced by the arrival of the new media. With the rise of the internet and social media, there's been a dramatic proliferation and fragmentation of the media. And this segments audiences as well as raising questions of reliability. And that affects our democratic debate. Where most people were once drinking from a common reservoir, as it were, now there's a tendency by many people to plug into just the stream that suits their views. With the proliferation of sources, it's become easier than once to live within your own media world, where your opinions are just reinforced, not challenged. In the traditional outlets, we're seeing media in Australia sharply divided by commercial and ideological interests. This is obvious, for example, in the News Corp attacks on the ABC. Not only does News Corp regard the ABC as left from where it sits, but the ABC is a big commercial rival, and talking down rivals can be especially important when commercial media is being squeezed for revenue. As you know, the ABC has always been highly regarded by the Australian community and is likely to remain so. But it will be interesting to see whether the trust in it is at all eroded by the attacks, not just from a big commercial rival, but also from the government. Another factor with the media when it comes to politics is that they're not just observers but players too. This has always been the case, but it's more obvious in our media-saturated market, and many people therefore have a lack of trust for that reason. There's also much more today opinion journalism, and related to this, many figures who are their own brand. People who are high-profile commentators are often likely to take very out-there stands. I put this in the most mild terms. And that's what gets attention. And the names are obvious. Alan Jones, Paul Murray, Ray Hadley, Andrew Bolt come to mind. If you reject their strongly stated views, you're probably unlikely to trust them. If you share those views, you may set your own political lights by them. And we've also seen in recent years the emergence of the controversial Sky After Dark, that is the Sky channel at night, which has come to resemble Fox Media. I think that one factor also in this, in people becoming jaded and distrustful of the media, is that there's actually too much media, in the sense we're constantly bombarded, too much noise, too much hype. More is not always better, especially when a lot of it might be termed junk media. The 24-hour news cycle means that you have to fill the space, often with speculation based on 4/5 of bugger all. And finally, I think distrust of the media is both a symptom of and an outcome of the general cynicism of our times. Now, does this distrust matter? I think it does. If people feel they can't trust the media, this may well reinforce their distrust of the whole political process. Inevitably, the media's coverage of politics is skewed to the negative because that's often where the stories are. But that further darkens people's views of politics. The media's watchdog role, when done properly, inevitably can bring it into difficult face-offs with politicians and governments. And we've seen this, of course, dramatically in the United States. And a politician like Donald Trump will go after the media and demonise sections of it and whip up his supporters against it as he seeks to protect himself against its scrutiny. In Australia, we see a very, very mild version of this when Scott Morrison dismisses questions, like he did last week when he was in Queensland, by saying, oh, that's the Canberra bubble. Well, of course, he's in the middle of the Canberra bubble. It's crucial that when the media are legitimately holding politicians to account, that they have the confidence of the public. Otherwise, the public might just be persuaded by these embattled politicians to distrust the journalists, just at the very moment when they should be seeing them as acting in the public interests. But remember that the public will never have one view of the situation. Some people will be supporters of the media, others will think it's part of the so-called swamp. Another cohort will appreciate the media's role but be critical of its shortcomings. When we turn to the task of restoring trust in the media, I wish I could bring you a set of obvious prescriptions. Unfortunately, they don't seem to exist. Media should be accountable for what they do, but using the power of government to get some of that accountability runs into issues of free speech immediately. There are already regulations that oversee electronic media, but this seems to have had little effect on certain parts of the media, although I do note the report this week that 2GB management was pulling Alan Jones into line, especially after he cost them a hell of a lot of money. On self-regulation, the Press Council's a pretty toothless tiger and is itself subjected to attacks, especially from News Corp. The internet is largely ungoverned and ungovernable, but there is mounting pressure on companies like Facebook to be more socially responsible. We'll see what happens. Now, I want to end with a paradox. The new media world has given citizens greatly enhanced power to be just that, active citizens, with access to more information than ever before and greater opportunities to put views. But this opportunity for people to interact has also allowed, even encouraged, outpourings of bitterness and hate. The internet gives participants a forum of unprecedented scale, where gatekeepers don't exist or can be bypassed. But so far, we've not found a way to get the benefits of the internet while dealing with its social costs. I'll leave it there, and thank God the bell hasn't rung.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm actually keeping my time as short as possible to give maximum time to the speakers, so I'd invite Scott Ludlam to please contribute.
Thank you, much appreciated. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on Aboriginal ground on the traditional country of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. And I would like to thank the Academy for this really well-chosen topic. As you can see, it's an incredibly well-qualified panel. I'm also a bit intimidated by how well-qualified the audience is. And I can only assume that I've been invited here as a provocateur, so I'll try not to disappoint in that regard. I, last July, wrapped up 9 years in the Senate, just not that far from where we're meeting today. And I've been in and around politics, I guess, for around 20 years at a state and federal level. And now I'm doing something a little bit different. But the question of trust and integrity in political institutions, obviously, I mean, you've seen the program. These are old questions. They probably go back as far as the foundation of settled agriculture in cities, and they are being faced with increasing urgency by people right around the world. And at the outset, I think for us, it's worth acknowledging how high the stakes are. On the other side of the world, a crisis in trust in the political machinery and the institutions of democracy in Brazil have seen the election of a guy called Jair Bolsonaro, and it coincided with a wave of warrantless police raids on universities across the country, interrogation of professors and academics, and seizing anti-fascist literature because it was seen as being prejudicial of Mr Bolsonaro's chances of winning the election, which he subsequently did. Brazil is a really proximate example of how distrust in the machinery of democracy, in the machinery of the state, can be exploited by the far right to consolidate political gains that can be very hard to reverse. In the US, which Michelle and others have already spoken of, is another very sharp contemporary example of how mistrust can be exploited in some instances by the very people who've been sowing that mistrust to capture and then hollow out the machinery and the institutions of the state. I've spent the last 11 months travelling around the world researching a book that engages with these questions in part. Speaking to academics, to activists, politicians and journalists from all over the place, try and get a sense of how much we have in common, but also to reset my bearings on how these things are unfolding in a very uniquely Australian way. And so we don't have armed police crashing our conference today, but I think we should be grateful and protective of that fact, and we should never take it for granted. When I think about trust, particularly trust in institutions, what comes to mind is, well, how wide is the gap between what a thing says it does and what it actually does? If an institution or a politician is saying one thing and clearly or covertly doing something completely different, then you don't trust it. And this runs much deeper, obviously, than our shallow and degraded politics. The current government was willing to risk an escalation of violence in Israel and Palestine and potentially put Australian diplomats in harm's way in order to swing a few votes in a by-election. And that's a sign of deeply untrustworthy individuals. It was done quite brazenly. That's all just kind of quietly gone away now. It was a stunt, but it was such a high-stakes stunt, and it's a deeply untrustworthy gesture. This Great Barrier Reef Foundation caper is another example. And I guess in one way we can be fortunate in that they're so bad at it, is that it makes it a little bit easier to analyse and kind of pull it apart. But that gap between what something says it will do or what you expect it to do and what it's actually doing, I think that's where the seeds of distrust are sown. And so the government in a constitutional democracy, the people who we place in positions of executive power are meant to govern for all. The representatives are meant to hold the public interest in trust. But what we know, and what became it's probably very evident to all of us, but became quite sharply evident to me in the course of my work over the road for a couple of years, is that much of Australia's foreign policy and our placement and standing in the world isn't set in that building. It's established in Washington, DC. And much domestic policy is also conceived of and articulated and orchestrated from corporate boardrooms, not from Parliament. And so you automatically have a gap between what a democratic institutions say that they have carriage of and what's actually going on. And so the causes of this distrust obviously run very deep. And we've got all day here and much smarter people than me to be part of the diagnosis, but I'm going to put one proposition at least, is that our politics and our government institutions over the last 30 or 40 years have been quietly turned from their original constituted purpose of serving the interests of the public to serving the interests of private capital. And where these interests coincide for a while, you can get away with it. But these interests are divergent in irreconcilable ways. Universities, for example, established hundreds of years ago, in some parts of the world thousands of years ago, for the purpose at varying times of public education, of fearless inquiry, of research, critical thinking, informing policymakers, and driving innovation. You convert an institution like that to a for-profit entity and its priorities realign. Not all at once, but slowly over time. Capital eventually imposes a form of parasitic loss on public institutions and on the institutions that it slowly captures. We can see this operating in different ways to greater or lesser degrees of extremity in different parts of the world, in healthcare, in transport, in urban planning, in things like childcare, even in defence, where we have US defence contractors sponsoring exhibitions in our own war memorial, which I remember as a child coming here for the first time as a place of immense solemnity. And now it has advertising for Boeing and McDonnell Douglas on some of the conference rooms and areas up there. And the media, as Michelle's already addressed, I don't think it's a coincidence or an oversimplification to point out that the trust in the ABC rates is vastly higher than the trust in the commercial platforms, and particularly the News Corp stable, which is quite brazen in the fact that it uses its media platforms as a weapon to advance its own commercial interests. Why should you trust that? Distrust in this context is entirely rational, in my view. It's adaptive. It's entirely understandable. And in fact, I wish that there was less trust in some of our institutions, that there would be more political reward then for standing up against mass surveillance and attacking cryptography standards that protect private communications in Australia and around the world. So I don't necessarily think we should see distrust in deeply compromised institutions as a bad thing. It would be, in my view, scarier if we still trusted some of these institutions. In the, I found anyway, a quite handy little guidebook by Tim Snyder called On Tyranny. If we're getting around to our to-do list before they ring the bell on me. His second point was defend institutions. His first point is don't obey in advance. It can be very costly, but it is essential to resist the things that are eroding and undermining trust in public institutions. I hope this isn't going to be a super provocative example, but the ANU fossil fuel divestment initiative of a couple of years back, I know that was very hard on people in here, but it also lit people up, and it is tremendously inspiring when people in a position of influence high up within institutions actually do make a public stand. Keep pressing the case for the boring but essential nuts and bolts of public accountability, a national ICAC or an integrity commission or whatever it is that we end up with, pressing ahead on donations reform, on transparency around the activities of lobbyists on Capitol Hill, and defend social movements where we often find the people out front of institutional actors. And that is going to be messy and controversial, but we can see from studying social movements throughout history that it's not going to start on Parliament House. In fact, they will be amongst the very last people to get it. The Campaign for Marriage Equality, I think, being one recent really important case study of how the politicians, by and large, were the last ones to the party, that was led by social movements. Trust comes when it's deserved. And if we look at the basic principles of deliberative democracy, again at the risk of oversimplifying, which I feel we can see the seeds of some forms of more highly evolved democratic practice than the Westminster machinery that we've inherited, there are a couple of things on the short list to make those processes of much more active and direct democracy work. One is full participation, where you start to flatten out the differences in diversity between the old white men sitting up on Capitol Hill and the incredibly diverse community that we are privileged to be a part of, particularly the imbalance in gender, but in representation by Aboriginal people and people of colour, differently abled people, as it's taking a very long time for the population on Capitol Hill to start to reflect the diversity of this country. So full and meaningful participation is the first. The second is access to information. The information well is being deliberately and strategically poisoned. This whole fake news phenomenon is designed to obscure and conflict with the collective intelligence. And so one, again, provocative example, are radical transparency initiatives. So, for example, the organisation of WikiLeaks took the core DNA of empire, of war, of capital, and dumped it into the public domain for journalists and campaigners to pick over and decide for themselves. And obviously that is an entity that's come under dramatic attack. And the third thing is executive power, is that if people don't feel as though their participation is meaningful and actually engages with the machinery of governance, then you simply disengage and you will wait for a demagogue to show up to tell you that he's going to fix everything up. The interests of private capital actually doesn't make that deliberative democratic shortlist. It's not that it's unimportant, but it's not on that shortlist. Trust comes when it's deserved, and I really look forward to being part of the conversation today. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Scott. And I'd now invite Grant King from the Business Council of Australia to make a contribution. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. Quite obviously I'm going to speak from a business perspective, and I'd like to just make a few points on the way through. And the first of those points is to begin by just pointing out perhaps what might be the obvious, and that's the difference between companies and business as an institution. The basis for some of my comments is something called the Edelman Report, which is one of the most oft-quoted and cited reports on trust. I don't know how many of you have seen it or are familiar with it, and I don't intend to present to it today. It is publicly available. But I will quote some information out of that report. The interesting thing is that when it comes to companies, they're quite well trusted. 75% of employees trust their companies, which is up 20% on the prior survey, so year-on-year survey results. 77% of respondents agree companies can grow profits and improve social and economic conditions in the economy. We know from our own surveys in the BCA that whilst trust in institutions like business has fallen, people still believe that companies create jobs, and it's the jobs that people want. So we see when it comes to companies quite a different outcome than for business at large. Many of you, when you've travelled, stayed in a hotel, flown on an aeroplane, taken a holiday, you'll now be besieged with surveys asking you to report your experience. They're driving things called Net Promoter Scores or CSATs. Companies are relentlessly interested in customer feedback so they can improve the quality of products that they offer. So at a company level, much is being done to maintain the trust of employees and customers, and many of the survey results show that to be the case. But of course, when you survey business, which is what, for example, the Edelman report and other reports do, trust in business has declined, as it has in all institutions. And what I want to try and do is address my comments more at this institutional notion of business rather than the individual notion of companies. Now, it's reasonable to say, in fact, it's very important to say that every year citizens ought to expect a better outcome. You know, in a modern Western economy like Australia, a modern Western economic democracy like Australia, we ought to expect better outcomes every year. Better jobs, more jobs, decent incomes, and a genuine social safety net. The question not is whether that's a reasonable expectation, that's what a modern and well-functioning economy should deliver. The question is, how do you do it? And I think there was a significant shift both globally around the time of the GFC and more so in Australia 4 or 5 years ago. And I say 4 or 5 years ago because when the GFC came along in 2008, Australia didn't suffer all that much from the GFC because there was in fact a boom in commodity prices that supported the Australian economy for another 3 or 4 years after that phase. But the significant turning point was a change in growth rates in both globally, but particularly, and I'll confine most of my comments to the Australian economy, a change in growth rates. Now, if you read The Economist of a week or so ago, you'll find that the feature article, the headline story in The Economist was the miracle of the Australian economy. I think the opening sentence said the last time Australia was in recession, the Soviet Union existed and the internet didn't. And that was the opening sentence. So the Australian economy has had this incredible run of 27 years of continuous growth, and that's an outstanding record in any comparative global term. But at one level, certainly the last 4 or 5 years, that growth has become more challenging because whilst we've seen growth in Australia, a lot of that growth has been driven by immigration. So our growth rates are not that, our economic growth rate is not much greater than our immigration rate. We like to look at Europe and talk about low growth rates, but with flat population growth, there's actually not much difference. We know that there's been little or no growth in real wages, and these are all issues that the community feels strongly. So the decline, if you like, the falling away of growth, so in probably the 20 years prior to the last 5, 6 or 7 years, growth in Australia averaged well over 3%. It's fallen into the 2%. And that's made quite a big difference in terms of our economy's ability to fund those extra things we ought rightly expect every year. But I think more importantly, from the point of view of this topic, has changed the conversation, because the conversation has changed from how do we share the dividend or benefit of growth. Certainly for 20 years through the 90s and into the 2000s, we benefited from a strongly growing economy, arguably off the back of substantial economic reforms undertaken by both sides of government in the 80s and 90s. It's a separate matter for discussion that our capacity of governments, or the capacity of our governments to undertake genuine economic reform in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years has obviously fallen away dramatically. But off the back of those reforms, we saw quite strong growth, increase in real wages. It's no surprise that when productivity increased, growth was strong and real wages grew. Those conditions fell away. So the conversation has changed from how do we share the benefits of growth to how do we transfer what we have. And that change in the conversation, I think, goes fundamentally to the undermining of trust, because the conversation has changed from substance to legitimacy. I need something, the only place I can get it from is from someone else. And so I need to put my case relative to someone else's cases. And we've taken the easy route in that conversation, and that is the route that's driven by a language much more around fear than it is around hope. And as a result, I think the community is right to be confused, because it hears this debate amongst the various both institutions but also organisations in society continuing to try and advance their case and their legitimacy by running down others. I was taught a long time ago as a youth and in business, do not try and make oneself look good by making others look bad. But that is actually the trick or trap that we've fallen into. We run others down rather than seek the substance and the positive. And I think that's a very unfortunate feature of the national discourse at the moment. It's not a discourse based on substance, it's a discourse based on legitimacy. There also used to be an expression that you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts, and many of us probably would have quoted that in years gone by. But that's, in a sense, clearly no longer the case, because something oft repeated and repeated loudly no longer needs a factual basis. It simply becomes a fact by way of repetition. And much of the national discourse is about loudness and repetition rather than really substantive analysis of what facts might be best brought to bear to any particular discussion. In turning to this language of fear, we see that people's concerns have grown dramatically. If we do dive into that Edelman survey, the proportion of the community that's concerned about issues has risen substantially. So global trade, 70% of people are concerned about whether global trade is good for them. 35% of people fear that global trade is bad for them. A different analysis would say that unquestionably through human history, the growth of trade has lifted people out of poverty and improved economic outcomes and social outcomes for people. 60% of people are concerned about immigration, and 30% fear that immigration is changing the nature of our society. 50% of people fear innovation. Innovation drives productivity. Productivity drives rise in real incomes. Addresses one of the key issues, which is lack of wages growth. 25% of people fear innovation and the impact that it will have on jobs. So what's happening is that when one turns to a conversation that targets organisations' legitimacy to have a point of view and feeds people's fears because that's the easier argument to make, again, it is no surprise that people don't know who to turn to, and there is a loss of trust. 60% of people believe what they will see in a search engine rather than a human. And that is concerning because when you look at how search engines like Google work, you could rightly be concerned because from a business point of view, Google provides you with tools to get your message to the top. Google provides you with tools to allow you to be the first thing that someone reads, buy my product or service. But it also allows you to put at the top your message as well. So it's quite a troubling statistic that 60% of people believe what they read in search engines or what search engines tell them rather than being able to find a more balanced presentation of the facts. So there are many factors out there which are, in my view, eroding the confidence people can have in their institutions. But I think when we examine this subject as representatives of various of those institutions, in my case business, we have to accept the responsibility we have for the way we've caused that debate to proceed. And in my view, we should always, and we are always better served by trying to turn to substance and facts that we can work with rather than legitimacy and fear. The question then might turn, well, what ought we do about it? And not surprisingly, given my earlier comments, what I would say is that it is a much easier conversation to have if our economy is growing more strongly. And the evidence of the last year, we're seeing economic growth move into the 3% rather than the 2%. We saw in the mid-year budget that the dividend of that increased growth was better Commonwealth revenues. We are clearly, I think now for the first time in a decade, able to see some return to a surplus. And therefore there is more to share. The last budget, and I'm not going to pass judgment on any particular aspect of the budget, but the last budget saw a greater capacity to share through personal income tax, for example, to citizens. And there is a reasonable prospect that the MyEFO that comes out at the end of this year, I think will also build even greater confidence that we're returning to surplus. But we're doing so off the back of economic growth. Economic growth is reducing unemployment. And the evidence would suggest, and we're beginning to see this evidence in the US as unemployment falls, in fact, below 4%, that as the labour market tightens, and I think the RBA has spoken to this very recently, in fact, in the last couple of days, that we are beginning to see the signs of wages growth again emerging in the economy. So not surprisingly, we would say that if we were having a discussion around substance, we would say one of the most important things we can do is choose those policies and argue for those positions that put the economy in a sound position, create a growing economy sufficient to provide the meaningful jobs that our people want, a growing income, which of course we would all like and need, and most importantly, provide a genuine social safety net for the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. I'd like to now ask Cassandra Goldie to make her contribution from the community sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I, acknowledge country, pay respects to elders past and present. Thank the Academy for the great invitation to spend some time on a very important debate today. I apologise that I was slightly about to be questioned in my own trust deficit by not being on time. The reason I was not here at the beginning of today's event was because I was up at Parliament House doing media about the slashing of funding for Food Bank and the fact that then as I was about to go on Sky, the Prime Minister tweeted that there was going to be a reversal of that decision after a major backlash from the community. So there's plenty, I think, to say about the trust deficit for the political sphere. I must say, I think there's also plenty to say about the trust deficit and the behaviour in business and why we are at the point where we are at. I'm here, though, I think, to comment on the community sector and the charitable sector. We're a feminised sector, and so I'm going to start with the things that we're not doing so well on, and to highlight some of the issues I think that are presented for charities in the community sector, and then we can go into some broader debates, I hope, about across the whole picture. Grant talked about the Edelman Trust Barometer, and certainly if you line up the comparison, from politicians, media, business and charities, the charitable sector typically comes out as having a higher level of trust afforded to it in comparison and contrast to, for example, politicians who, as Scott has highlighted, typically rank very, very low. And also, if we look at the Essential Poll or also the analysis by the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, again, in sort of comparative terms, whilst the charitable sector ranks lower than doctors, the High Court, and a couple of others, we still are, again, relatively well recognised for having comparative trust in the community. But I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that we absolutely, A, cannot rest on the laurels about that, and B, that in fact the trend is a decline in trust amongst charities and the community sector. And that should worry us. So I want to talk about, and some of this is speculative, but I would like us to consider what might be some of the factors that are leading to this decline in the trust and confidence that the community affords to charities and community organisations. I think one of the obvious areas is significant examples of very bad behaviour, both historical and more contemporary. There are a number of key areas where there has been very shocking exposure of very bad behaviour. Of course, the Royal Commissions into child sexual abuse, and the fact that many charities and faith-based organisations were directly responsible. Similarly, the alarm about examples of very bad behaviour, for example in aged care, and the fact that we've now triggered a Royal Commission into what is going on in that sector. So these are very obvious examples of where you say one thing, you say you're values-driven, you're mission-driven, you are there as caring organisations, come to us and we will look after you, and in fact your behaviour is extraordinarily the contrary of what you are promising to do. I think there's a second trend that is leading to this decline in trust and confidence, which is both by design and by government policy, a significant gutting of the capacity of small community-based organisations to be at the forefront of the delivery of great community services, and a privileging of large, corporatised, big machines delivering community services, and increasingly through a for-profit business model. And there has been government policy to do that. Competition policy is not a new thing in human services. It is alive and well and has been for over 20 years. A key example is the Job Active Employment Services System. ACOS recently did a survey about the people's experiences of Job Active. It was shocking, to hear the voices of people. The language that was used was not even "we don't trust you anymore," but that these were organisations that were seen to be abusive, to not care, to be all about self-interest, about making profit off the back of people who were really desperately just trying to get a job. And of course, the corollary of the so-called business model is that unless you are very careful as a larger organisation, you increasingly are not delivering community services with stable, ongoing human relationships. The same person. I mean, trust is a very human instinct. Who am I going to see today? Will you be the same person next week? Do I have a relationship that can grow, that you are somebody I know who will turn up and faithfully be there when I need you? The business model of increasingly sort of low unit costs and being able to digitise the application of labour. And so you never know who's going to turn up, for example, in a particular design around home care for people who are trying to stay at home when they become older. They don't know who is going to be today. Transparency. I'm very proud that the community sector, the charitable sector, not only has ducked and weaved away from greater regulation, but actually advocated for the establishment of the charity regulator. ACOSS and many others wanted to be transparent about the use of tax deductions, about ensuring that if you didn't know whether a charity was legitimate, you could easily find who they were and be able to track them down to have confidence in that being a legitimate organisation. But again, I think there are key developments that have started to undermine a sense of the transparency. And just one example that has, because today is when the Gender Equality Agency is out talking about the gender pay gap and the fact that that is not only chronically persisting, but in some contexts is widening. I'm aware that increasingly, for example, the charitable sector also does not disclose pay rates when it advertises jobs. Increasingly, it's taken on the kind of, that's our business, using increasingly, sort of private sector recruiters and the sense of where is the money going, what is going on, and the kind of a sense that the question marks over whether or not, to the greatest extent possible, the money coming into the community sector is going to the mission and purpose of that organisation. So that's a question, I think, for us to pose for ourselves. I think related to that is a sense of some significant politicisation of the charitable sector and the community sector, and we really have to watch it. Some of this is definitely been driven by the context in which the community sector is endeavouring to operate. One of the tests, as we know, about sort of trust, as I say, is that your behaviour is consistent with what you say. But there has been a significant decline, we think, in the extent to which community organisations and charities are prepared to speak up and stand up for and be a part of the public debates to have the back of people who are more vulnerable in the community. This is not, from many conversations I've had with people in my sector, this is not where charities want to be. But it's the so-called chilling effect that we've seen by a raft of behaviours by particularly the federal government in our context that have led to the so-called chilling effect on charitable organisations. The notion that if you speak up and if you're critical of government for its treatment of the people with whom you are daily working, that you will lose your own funding in order to be able to continue to exist to provide the high quality community services that many charitable organisations do provide. And so at ACOSS we are certainly very consistent in saying it is crucial that community organisations to continue to speak up on behalf of the people with whom we work, because in many cases the issues that people are working on the ground are directly related to systemic problems, and the food bank example is a classic one. And I note that Food Bank quite recently published an excellent report which provided the big picture about food insecurity in Australia and the fact that 4 million people in any given year are experiencing food insecurity, and that Food Bank highlighted that one of the key reasons for that is because the federal government will not increase the level of social security, the increase to Newstart. In other words, Food Bank did its job of being a high-quality community organisation that, with all of its experience on the ground, helped to stand up and have the back of the people with whom it was daily having contact, or the services with whom it worked. And the corollary, the fifth factor, I just flag it up, is I think the extent to which we're increasingly taking the human out of human services, and the digitisation of the delivery of human services is inevitably going to lead to less ability for people to know who they're really dealing with. Are you government? Are you collecting data on me? What are you going to do with it? That kind of feeling. And finally, I think this context about poverty and inequality and power relationships in society, which affect community organisations like all the other public institutions. The more we have, and we do have, a significant real growth in the accumulation of wealth for people who are already wealthier in the Australian community, and the fact that we have the second highest rate of poverty of any wealthy OECD country except the United States, leads to people in the community feeling more at risk. And that, therefore, I think has a corrosive effect in terms of people's sense of the balance and the power dynamics in the dealings between the various parts of public policy that do affect the daily lives and experiences of people in the Australian community. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra. And now for our final panellist, Professor Stephen Parker. Thank you. You, certainly.
I'm sorry about this. I prefer standing up when I deliver. I'm institutionalised. The former Chief Justice of Australia, Sir John Latham, when still a politician, met Mussolini in the 1930s. Latham was telling Mussolini about the Australian Constitution and the power of the High Court to declare legislation and executive actions invalid. Mussolini is said to have listened and at the end asked, "Yes, Mr. Latham, but how does the court get its order with such far-reaching effect obeyed? Does the court have an army or an enforcing agency?" Latham responded, "No, Mr. Mussolini, it doesn't work that way. The court simply pronounces its decision and it will be obeyed. That's how the system works." And Mussolini replied, "Truly, Mr. Latham, your answer is remarkable. You have anarchy in your system." Well, this exchange has stayed with me since I read about it maybe 20 years ago, and I used it in a study for the Commonwealth called Courts and the Public, which was fundamentally about how public confidence in the independence and integrity of the court system is central to the maintenance of justice in a liberal democracy. One of the few views about institutions I still hold as strongly. But I think the purpose of this opening mapping session is for speakers to put some confronting ideas out there. So from this point on, I think I'll depart from orthodoxy. Speakers were asked in their briefing notes, and I'm sure rightly, they were told that there is declining trust amongst Australians in government. I'm sure that's right. But we were also told the challenge is to regenerate both integrity and trust in Australian institutions, and that it is a greater imperative than ever before. Well, before turning to my topic, higher education, I'd just like to question this, partly on the grounds that some institutions have proved to be so unworthy through their behaviour that I doubt I would believe a word they say anymore, but partly on the grounds that the basis for institutions in earlier societies might now be decaying. Well, I won't dwell on the behaviour issues, although they've been alluded to. They're well ventilated in film and royal commissions, which suggest that some are little more than benign fronts for crime rings. But the basis for having institutions at all today needs some discussion and leads into my points about higher education. It's common for those institutions which are also organisations to be explained and justified in terms of their structure, function and culture. Well, I've had a reasonably long acquaintance with structures and restructures of organisations to be wary of any claims that a particular structure is natural or inevitable. Often it turns out to be about feather bedding, preserving privileges or reaffirming a view of the world. Function can also be viewed cynically as masking a different underlying purpose. Clark Kerr, the architect of the University of California system, defined universities as faculty entrepreneurs brought together by a common grievance over car parking. That, he said, was their true function. But that's an internal perspective. From the outside, I can quite see the past functional arguments for institutions. Rather like Ronald Coase's theory of the firm, institutions may in the past have reduced transaction costs, relieving people of the need to undertake their own risk mitigation because they could trust in their integrity, and so on. And still on function, institutions can also reproduce themselves over time, adjusting to new circumstances, rather than needing to be created afresh as conditions change, which is efficient in a way. I wrote a book on the history of marriage and cohabitation since the Industrial Revolution, whilst here at the ANU, which was very much along these lines. But new technologies are enabling direct relations between creators of value and end users. They are disintermediating exchanges. They are stripping out layers of cost, and they're possibly eliminating rent-seeking behaviours. If blockchain really does stack up, and if the world's electricity supply can power all these packets of data being distributed, it seems that the trust function of some institutions could be obsolescent. We see disintermediation with the collapse of large corporations, once thought of as institutions. We've seen it with the Encyclopaedia Britannica. We see it with much public administration. We're seeing it even in civil justice, where ADR, alternative dispute resolution, is being replaced by ODR, online dispute resolution. And the third lens on institutions, culture, is no less problematic. How often does culture turn out to be other than it appears? At the risk of really attacking religion, the recent St James Ethics Centre report on Cricket Australia's culture is an interesting read, particularly to someone from my ethnic origins. Well, I don't see higher education as an institution, although that's an interesting question, but I do see universities as institutions. In fact, there might be very interesting examples. Still held in high regard by most, still the aspiration of many, whether prospective students, teachers, and congratulations, Adam, or researchers. Huge economic players. The combined revenues of Australia's public universities has now reached $30 billion. They're drivers of Australia's third largest export industry, international education, and so on. But back to the lenses of structure, function, and culture. Do we need 40 of them? And do we need them where they are now? Do we need them when they're incapable of amalgamating with each other, although the arguments seem compelling? Do we need their internal structures? If you were starting afresh and designing a university, would you design them as they are now? My answer is probably no on all accounts, or at least it is now. And the function of universities might seem obvious, but there are huge advances in learning technologies, not just staring at screens, but via headset experiences, group discussions that transcend the globe, and so on. Will we really need so many expensive, capital-intensive entities in the middle between syllabus and student? The University of Oxford academics, pioneering the Wolf University, claimed to be the world's first blockchain university, clearly think not. Well, I actually buy a university's research function more than their teaching function. The market will always fail in pure research, but the teaching function is more in doubt. I understand the arguments about the cohort effect, the socialization function for young people gathering together, talking about Nietzsche, dead into the night, maybe. But it is only 30 years ago since a mere 10% of the population went to universities. What did the rest do? Did they walk around saying, if I could only meet another human being? Which takes me into culture, or at least social class. Participation by low SES students has edged up in recent years, but it's still low, and it is very low amongst those institutions which above all see themselves as institutions. Arguably, their function is better described as the reproduction of advantage, grooming further privilege onto the already privileged. This invitation to stir the pot a bit has finally made me sort out in my mind the difference between mistrust and distrust. Mistrust is a tendency not to have confidence. Distrust is a complete lack of confidence, often based on experience. I think we should aim for a society with the fewest possible institutions so that those which do persist are clearly justified. I think we should approach all so-called institutions from a position of mistrust and encourage them to earn our confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'll now invite the facilitator, Michelle Grattan, to begin a panel discussion among our varying views on where trust and integrity now lies and how the problem has mapped out. Thank you, Michelle.
Well, if I can just throw some questions at the fellow speakers. I can start with you, Stephen. Culture wars have been a feature of our debate, our public debate, especially in recent years. And it does seem to me that universities are often a target of some of the culture warriors. I wonder whether you think that this has had an effect of reducing trust in these institutions in higher education.
I think it probably has. It's an empirical question, but I would imagine that persistent attacks by the ignorant have some effect. And so I'm not sure that I have anything particularly original to say other than that universities should fight back and assert.
How can they do that?
Their independence. I think they could be more effectively represented than they are at the moment, and their collective bodies I don't think are behaving particularly astutely. So that's possibly a conversation for another day. So I could commend a different approach to universities and their public relations based around the integrity and authenticity of their research. My point about universities was partly about the institutions bit, which is a theme of today, which I think in some ways clouds the discussion. I don't know that we need the theme of institutions. We've got people, we've got organisations, we've got leaders, we've got values. I think we should analyse those in their own terms.
Grant, coming to you, I think for many people, the disclosures that we've had over the last few years about bad behaviour in the banking sector and financial sector more generally have been quite shocking. To what extent does the business sector feel that this has been a game changer in terms of ordinary people's confidence in institutions that previously they believed in?
Thanks, Michelle. Look, there's no question that behaviour that's been brought to light in the Royal Commission, there's been many examples of egregious behaviour and the community is rightly concerned about them. And at the end of the day, they'll, through the Royal Commission and ultimately through legal proceedings, if necessary, people will be held to account. There's no doubt about that. And we would say that is the right and proper thing to do. The point I would make is that I think we need to be very careful not to, so first of all, we have to just acknowledge that's very clear. There's no drawing back from that point. But I think it's important not to let those things define sectors. You know, so for example, Cassandra also acknowledged in the Royal Commission in respect of child abuse, and also who knows what the aged care one is going to show. But my view is that will not define the not-for-profit sector either. I mean, the not-for-profit sector is an enormous force for good, and so is business. Business delivers most of the things we take for granted every day. I won't go through a long list, but world's knowledge at a keystroke, fresh food in the city every day, you know, a whole host of things that are delivered by large businesses. So somehow we've got to acknowledge, or not somehow, we do have to acknowledge the egregious behaviour that's occurred, unquestionably. We have to make sure that those are addressed in whatever way is appropriate. But I think it's also important that we don't allow that to define the contribution that any particular institutional sector of the economy makes. And I think, you know, I, for example, will continue to argue that business delivers many, many good outcomes, as do all other institutional sectors of the economy or in society.
Cassandra, you made an interesting point about moving from small, more human institutions to big, professionalised bodies delivering services. I wonder whether people relate less to the voluntary and charitable sector these days because, for example, in its fundraising, it has become so professionalised, so large. You know, you might get not one appeal from the Lost Dogs Society, the RSPCA or whatever, but routinely about 4 letters a year. Do people become, perhaps distrustful is not quite the word, but more cynical about this sector when it seems to behave like many other parts of the community rather than being special?
Well, I talked about this in the context of the policy settings that we've experienced over the last 2 decades.
And delivery of service,
you know, through as Grant rightly highlights, over 27 years of sustained economic growth, and the fact that a few weeks ago we were clocked as the most wealthy country in the world by Credit Suisse. But we saw, for example, in the 2014 budget, a cut of 1.5 billion out of community services, and of course for international aid organisations there's been a shocking cut. So I want to see these questions in that context. It's definitely the case that there are, in fact, the ACNC work on trust has highlighted that the practices around the collection of donations is a problem, particularly when people experience donations as being collected by often a sort of a casualised workforce, contracted in, outsourced business model with people with a script about why you should contribute to, you know, climate change or helping children, rather than it being a human connection where you are in solidarity, meeting somebody who is actively working on those issues and who says, join with us, get involved, be a part of the making the world we want to see. Which of course is, you know, not always, but very much the role that civic organisations at the local community level play, providing the social connection, the opportunities to get involved in the work of improving your community. And when the federal government in the 2014 budget did a big cut to community services, one of the policies was to just not fund anymore organisations that were getting less than, I think it was about $150,000, just not fund them at all. You know, uneconomic to do it, completely out of touch with the high value that those very small organisations played at the local community level. We've got a debate today about loneliness, and these civic institutions really provide a wonderful positive way to get involved. This is not old school thinking. And in fact, I'm very encouraged by the social movement and activism that I see. I mean, Scott, probably in your world in Western Australia, you're seeing it all around you, but the role of service delivery organisations is increasingly being undermined because of the desperate desire for revenue in that bigger context I painted, and the way in which you're going to get that money in the door.
Scott, now you're out of Parliament, are you shocked more than you used to be by the behaviour of politicians? Do you agree that this behaviour really is undermining people's regard for politics? And why do politicians not accept, as a class, not being partisan about this, but as a class, not accept the need to behave better as part of restoring trust?
Whoa. Wow. I know I'm a bit of an outlier in the room when I say that actually some of my closest friends are politicians, so I am a little bit reluctant to treat them all as a job lot because I've worked amongst the very best of them, and there are people, and also in a non-partisan sense, up on that hill who slog their absolute guts out, are rarely seen on television or read about in the newspaper, who work tirelessly for people in their electorate. So just doing my own little bit here to restore trust. It's not a total shit show up there. There are people working incredibly hard, and being a part of a team that, in my view, is doing that means that my cynicism about the political class, as you put it all together, is tempered by the fact that it isn't so black and white.
But people see the bad behaviour, that is
Right.
the point.
Well, the bad behaviour is clickbait. Some of the bad behaviour is kind of compelling to watch in the way that a train smash in slow motion is compelling to watch, and that's why some of these people do it. It's showmanship. Donald Trump's background, I didn't realise this until I kind of went back through the record a bit. His background, not just as a reality show host, but also in professional wrestling in the United States. Like, that's pure theatre. The guy knows how to get a grab and how to motivate a big crowd through pure theatre. Spending nearly a year out of this country and talking to people engaged in this work around the world, when I've come back, it has been a shock, actually, Michelle, the degree to which the debate has coarsened and become, at the same time, shallower, even in the year that I've been away, the 15 months or so that I've been out of formal politics, is a bit of a shock. And I think, our present Prime Minister, I don't know if it's wise to kind of name names or not, but our present Prime Minister, that seems to be his thing, is like a really shallow, degraded, quite brazen, stuff a pie into my gob sort of attempt at relating to people, which is so profoundly unrelatable. And all we can do, I guess, is be grateful that their polling is in a state of collapse, which means that people aren't buying it. I don't know if I answered your question or just drifted off into a tangent then. But.
Well, you did produce this wonderful image that I'll keep in my head of question time as the train crash. There are, of course, victims in train crashes, but perhaps we should move on to questions now.
Yep, certainly. Now, does anyone in the audience... Oh, we have microphones, so does anyone have a question? We have a couple already. I'll try and keep track. We've got about 15 minutes, so if you could keep your question to a question, that would be fantastic.
My question arises from comments that Scott made towards the end of his presentation on participatory democracy. And it strikes me that this is an area which has considerable potential but is little known. So, for example, Australia is a member of the Open Government Partnership. One of the commitments that members of the Open Government Partnership make is to have active community engagement. And in Australia's case, that's been part of the first National Action Plan and now the second National Action Plan. And yet it is very little known, despite many success stories around Australia, admittedly mostly at the state or local government level rather than at the national level, but at least the Department of Industry has produced some guidelines, some guides which will assist other agencies within the Commonwealth to adopt this. But my question to the entire panel is not so much why is it not well known, but what can be done to better inform the community and the political class on the opportunities offered by participatory democracy.
Kick off? It's a fascinating subject, and I reckon it's worth a whole day's symposium. My go-to on questions like that is a woman called Jeanette Hartz-Karp. Oh, we lost the mic. Jeanette Hartz-Karp, who ran a process for the former Gallup government in WA called Dialogue with the City. They put 1,000 people representative of the community, and they locked them in a room with a pile of experts and engineers and architects and so on, and they locked them in a room for a week, and they said, how do you want your city to work? And it's a completely different form of planning where you're mixing regular people's experience, and a homeless person is going to be sitting next to an engineer and an architect, and they came out with a plan which, small g, I found profoundly green. They came out with a plan for the evolution of the whole city that was very, very humane and quite green. And then that was handed over to the formal power structures, which then spent the next 20 years kind of watering it down, sabotaging it and making it disappear. And for me, how you do it, to answer your question directly, is again, it's kind of those three, you need those three things for it to work. You need it to be properly representative, you need it to be well informed and have access to information. And the most important one is we need to find a way for it to take power. If these deliberative assemblies don't have power to make changes according to the deliberations, then they're a complete waste of everyone's time. And that's a profoundly political question. And I think the only way to make it work is what we're seeing emerging around the world, is it's very bottom up. It's not a coincidence, it's emerging at the local and state levels. Brazil, again, another really interesting example, where in some big cities they're doing participatory budgeting. You put people back in control of the money, that gets your attention.
Perhaps we should move on rather than everyone have a go, because we've got such limited time. Just one point on that. I think the Museum of Australian Democracy is doing some work on this matter.
Yep. Jeff, please.
May I thank the...
We can't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. Thank you for the excellent discussion. One of the points that struck me forcibly was the crass example of the Prime Minister trying to get the Jewish vote for short-term gains as an example all over Australian life now of people completely or almost completely disregarding long-term consequences of short-term gains. I think Tony Jones, for example, is another example of this, who ought to know better. Have you any ideas about how we may bring to people a sense of responsibility and to think of long-term consequences before they go into action on short-term gains?
Can I just check if you meant Tony Abbott rather than Tony Jones? I thought we liked Tony Jones.
Tony Jones. I meant Q&A.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But I'll put Tony
Yep. Look, I think I'm very encouraged by the growing demand for that kind of approach to government and decision-making. And I think I see it in the more institutional organisations around ACOSS, as well as ACOSS's own approach, but also, again, at the more grassroots level. I was very struck by the government, as you might recall, announced in the federal budget a package of personal income tax cuts of $144 billion over the next decade, which, once it's fully implemented, it's going to be, if you look at the projections over the medium to long term, we're going to have a revenue problem in light of that. And there was not this overwhelming rise up of public support for it. And in fact, we were struck by the extent to which people were saying, actually, don't give me my $10, make sure you spend the money on the essential services that we need. In fact, the community is very literate around the fiscal position of the country, but far more than government gives them credit for. So I don't like us to give up on demanding a more sort of participatory approach to the decision-making, because actually that is the way that we will back in the political class, I think, to hold the line on some of these short-term approaches to policy. Grant would be very familiar with the fact that we endeavoured to do that with the union movement, with the Business Council of Australia and a number of other business peaks and ACOSS, to ground some of the sort of directions for reform over the next decade. A couple of years ago, we took that as an offer to the government at the time, and they kind of, for a moment, thought about it, and then they went into short-term politicking. And so I do think we have to continue to show the political class that you don't get rewarded, actually, for those kinds of tactical policy moments, including that $144 billion. I don't think that's flown through to any political support for the government, and quite rightly at this point in time.
Can I just add a point that I think the short-termism is very much promoted by the fact that these days we have the permanent election campaign, the continuous election campaign. One election starts the day after another one ends. Partly this has been promoted by narrow majorities or minority government, but not entirely. It's a phenomenon you see in America too. So that's just one of the problems you have to overcome to get more focus on the long term. It's very difficult.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and Sue, you have the mic.
Sue Richardson. This question is to Grant. One of the sources, I'm confident, of distrust in the community is the power of lobby groups in the halls of government. And I'm asking you whether you would personally, and whether you could speak on behalf of the Business Council, commit to advocating for complete transparency of ministers' diaries.
Well, that wouldn't worry me, that's a matter for ministers. But I think it's important to note that every institution has lobby groups, not just business. So, yeah, lobby groups are a feature of every aspect of, and let me use the term, institutional life. I think ACOS is probably a lobby group, you know, and so to...
We'd be delighted to have the diaries opened up.
Yeah, so, yeah, it wouldn't worry us in the slightest, but that's a matter for politicians. Some do, some don't.
Perhaps if I could ask Scott's opinion on having diaries open, and that will close the session.
Yes, just straightforwardly, yes. I feel as though it's one of those things in the constellation of accountability where we have to get 25 boring things right. You know, these kind of bracing structures around institutional power. Lobbyist diaries is one. The revolving door where politicians leave Parliament and immediately take up lobbyist positions in these powerful industry lobbies is another one. Donations reform, I think, is another one. And just the kind of the cultural lock on political power that some of these really powerful economic interests have. And I think it's a tiny bit disingenuous to try and balance out somebody who's walking Parliament House advocating for homeless people as opposed to somebody walking the corridors of Parliament House saying, unless you abolish the mining tax that we hate, we're going to roll you out of office and we're going to spend millions of dollars doing it, and we mean it. There's the false equivalence, I think, masks a really steep power imbalance amongst the people who are in Parliament. And this is not an anti-lobbyist thing. The idea is of that building, you wouldn't know it from the horrific security installations which are going up all around it, is that it's meant to be an open door building. The community's meant to be in there. Mining lobbyists, banking lobbyists, homelessness advocates, environmentalists, Aboriginal people, you're all meant to be up on that hill. It's not a problem that people are there. It's this tremendous imbalance of power and the opacity, which I guess is which the diary question goes to, of who's having coffee with who at any given time. And I guess we all know the answer to those questions.
Thank you. Well, that's a very good question because it is now... I was told otherwise. We have a question here, please. And then there was one further at the back and one there. So we've got 3 more questions.
Thank you. I want to pick up the point that not always is the loss of trust bad. I think we live in a much more highly educated, more individualistic society than, say, at the time of Federation. And that has led to us being much less prepared to take things, much less respect for authority. A lot of the trust in the past was because we had a lot of respect for authority. Now we question authority, and that's probably a good thing. In fact, the people who are most trustful are what I would call populists. It's their audience that trust them. They're looking for a strong man. They don't want to know the reasons. So I think we need to bear that in mind, that that loss of respect for authority and the demand to be better informed is a good thing. And so looking for solutions, I really think accountability lies at the centre of it. We just heard a question about accountability for who's talking to whom, who's got influence. But it goes beyond that. And what I would remark as someone who spent a lot of time working in government and trying to reform government in the 1980s, 1990s, is that we had, the main part of those reforms was about in trying to prove accountability. There was FOI, for example. There was also an enormous amount of public information on terms of program performance, cost effectiveness and so on. It was mandatory that all programs were subject to evaluation in the 1990s. Now that's disappeared, or it's resisted constantly. And I think that goes to, if you like, the opportunities for governments to become unaccountable is why they're mistrusted. I'd be interested in panel's views on that.
Well, maybe Stephen.
Well, I am entirely in sympathy with that. I'm sure that there has been a diminishing trust in authority over the years, but as you might have picked up from my remarks, I think that's probably a positive thing. And I think we should be increasingly sceptical about behaviours and institutions. I would fully accept the idea of seeing who's meeting whom. And I think I'm staggered. I don't know, I might be becoming more radical as I get older. I'm just staggered by how much we trust public officials when they're presenting behaviour, let alone their underlying behaviour, clearly doesn't seem to merit it. So, look, I don't think I can add anything more, but I think we should be having a deeply sceptical edge to our analysis today.
I think one interesting feature of the system is that there is often information out there or available. And for example, one development that's happened over the decades is the amount of material that comes out through Senate committees and inquiries and so on. A problem from a media perspective is that there's been such a squeeze on media resources and a retilting towards a coverage that's almost overwhelmingly political, that a lot of this material that ought to be exploited cannot or is not fully exploited. You've got far fewer specialists, for example, writing in policy areas relatively these days in the media. So it is a matter of just mining what is there as well as expanding through various other ways this whole thing, this whole area of accountability and getting it out there to the public and to the relevant audiences.
Can I just, yeah. Oh, sorry. So just one comment. It's fascinating, in a world where we cannot guarantee the protection of data in any way, shape or form, then everything becomes known. Now, my view is that the greatest form of accountability is transparency. Everything becomes known. The rate at which it becomes known has exponentiated, and it amazes me how many people make decisions on the basis that no one will ever know. We've got to get that out of the system. So I actually think we live in a far more accountable world than we've ever lived in. And the reality is technology is opening it up more and more quickly all the time. And I think that's a great world to live in. I think transparency is the key to accountability. And the quicker we understand that, the better.
I think, of course, transparency is a part of it, but I also think consequences is really crucial. I mean, I think it's stunning, personally, that we still really have no basic rights protections in Australia. The only method we have at the moment at federal level is the Parliamentary Scrutiny Committee on Human Rights, which was lauded as the sort of the dialogue model with the Australian Parliament about the protection of the very basic rights in the Australian community. And yet, for example, in the social security area, that committee has persistently found that the legislation that has cut incomes to single parents, introduced the cashless debit card, proposed random drug testing, has consistently found that those engage basic human rights and actually fail the test of proportionality. In other words, it's a human rights violation, and it doesn't even, nobody in the media ever bothers to even report on it, let alone is it a topic of significant debate in the Australian Parliament that we are persistently passing legislation. So that's transparent, but there's no consequences and there's no ability to bring anybody to account for that. And I hope you're right, Grant, about the consequences out of that Royal Commission. But I don't think at the moment people have a high confidence that that will actually occur, that individuals and entities will be held to account for a range of violation of basic rights.
Okay, we have one more question. Quick, I hope.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a fantastic discussion. What I heard from you was, so some of the big structural drivers that have created this sort of a financialisation of everyday life, a commodification of everyday life, a corporatisation of everyday life, a privatisation of everyday life. And each of you alluded to many of the structural drivers contributing to that. Implicit in there, to me, are issues of principles and values. You didn't speak about them explicitly, and I would just like to hear your reflections on the roles of a sort of a principles-based approach to everything that we've been speaking about, and the role that values play in this. You know, if I was being very cynical, and often in conversations with some of my sort of political colleagues, they will say, we don't care. And so where do you go with that in the rebuilding of the trust and I would say integrity? So your thoughts on principles and values?
Okay, just a nice, simple one to finish the session with. I'm really glad that you raised it though. So speaking only for myself, obviously not for the rest of the panel, I feel like where I was trying to get to was we need to regain the principle of the community and of the collective. We've been driven very hard since the 1970s in the Western world at least, and I guess the whole planet has copped it in various degrees, down a very private kind of valorisation of private values and valorisation of the individual, which I've actually no problem with, but actually that is used to mask the increasing institutional power of private entities and corporations and transnational capital, which is where I was trying to get to in here. Which basically says you transfer as much of the public realm into the private realm as you can get away with, and then you deregulate it and deconstrain it. And at the same time as you're doing that, you're attacking the public institutions that have previously constrained those actors. So the principle that I want to get to is revalorising and reminding ourselves of the value of the collective, the value of the community, the value of what we owe to each other as a society, because often this cult of individualism is actually code for something very, very different, which is attacking the public realm for the benefit of very large, powerful private actors. We see it very explicitly in the United States, and in Australia, we've adopted a particular strain of it, which I think is approaching a very dangerous measure. I'll come back to Brazil where I started. Private capital doesn't actually need democracy. It's completely indifferent to it. It doesn't necessarily need democratic checks and balances. They're operating in a parallel plane. And if we think that those things are valuable, if we think that's part of our value set and our principles, they need to be vigorously and angrily and very publicly defended.
I think there is a risk in this debate that we actually become part of the problem in reflecting back to the community that we are increasingly becoming very bad people. In fact, when you put that to the test, on every single issue that we care about, marriage equality is one, you're getting at least about 60 up to 70, sometimes 80% of the community backing basically good values. And so this is the sort of democratic deficit that we're grappling with here. But as I keep saying to people, when we give examples of the sorts of things that this particular government has done, which we think goes against basic values, like, you know, cutting funding to food bank at the same time as offering really generous tax cuts at the high end, the values in the community are going, we don't like it. So I think this is a question for the major parties to really look at themselves, and the fact we've got a government that is not doing well in the polls is saying something about where the community is at the moment on some of these very big and fundamental questions about the kind of society we want. I mean, the issue of privatisation, actually the public doesn't want increasing privatisation of essential services. Every time you get asked that, people don't want it. They want reliable, affordable, know who's providing it, and would be very happy for their local government to do it as long as they knew where to find it. Thanks.
Okay. On that point, I think I'm going to have to cut everybody off because now we are getting in between people and coffee. I'd like everybody to thank our panellists, and please, you can continue the conversation with coffee just outside, and if everybody could be back here at 10 minutes to 11 for the next session. So please thank our panellists.